All right, then. Hey, thanks for everybody joining this one, and thank you for Tony for getting this set up. This is being done by the South Dakota Department of Agriculture and Natural Resources. I serve on the Forest Health team along with Tony, and this is our opportunity on a monthly or bi-monthly basis to share with you some information that's fairly appropriate for the time. And this time of year, of course, it's cold. And we've all seen a few days that have been extremely cold, colder than we normally have seen, or at least in the past couple of winters. And so what sort of damage do we see because of this injury to the plants, that is? And then also, what's this do to pests? And so this one, which will probably be a little shorter just because it's a fairly specific topic, is kind of go over what we have seen with this winter so far and what we expect to see and why we see this sort of damage. So let's get started here with low temperature injury on plants and pests. Well, first of all, obviously, about 6 months from now, plants will be starting to look like this. They'll be leafed out, bright green, hopefully, filled with water, hopefully. Drought may have an impact. But at this time of year, they all look like this, or at least all our deciduous plants look like this. And they're fully fine, prepared for winter, and to a large degree can endure whatever may come to them. But they're dormant. And there's three stages, not stages, three types of dormancy that we have out there for woody plants. One of them is paradormancy, and that's hormones, particularly auxin, which is produced by the buds at the tip, and that prevents the laterals from growing. Now, that has nothing to do with winter, but it is a type of dormancy. And so that terminal bud that you see in this picture here is producing a growth regulator. We call them hormones now too, that actually inhibits those laterals, those side branches, from really expanding and developing into their own shoots. Now, we see that with pines, obviously, and spruce. That's how they maintain that pyramidal shape when they're young, is that terminal bud exerts very strong apical control and apical dominance. It maintains those laterals from growing on their own, and they maintain what we call an excurrent shape, this very upright shape. If you cut off the top of that, yes, they'll balloon right out. And other trees do that as they age as well, and that would be our oaks, our maples, and that will assume that more rounded shape because they don't have very strong control. In other words, their paradormancy is very minimal. But the dormancies we want to talk about at this time of year are two. One going into winter, and that's the ectodormancy, and that prevents growth from occurring in response to decreasing day lengths, actually increasing nights, but we typically talk about them as day lengths, and lower temperatures. And of course, we see that every year. Every fall, the days get shorter and shorter and shorter until up to what, December 21st. And now they're getting ever so slowly longer. And then we also see the temperatures dropping in the fall. It's a natural occurrence, has gone on forever up here, and plants have adapted that. They've used those as cues that, guess what, prepare for winter. And by doing that, the leaves begin to wither and drop, perhaps changing color at that time, and they completely fall. Now, getting ready for winter is really a two-stage process. And the whole point of this is you don't want water to freeze in the cells. Think of cells in the plant, whatever tissue they may be forming, as little water balloons. They truly are. And if water freezes in that balloon, it's going to burst. And if it bursts, that cell is dead. And if enough cells die in a tissue, that tissue no longer operates. And throughout the plant no longer operates and it dies. And so one of the things that northern plants want to avoid is water freezing in the cells. And since they have to go through a winter time period of freezing temperatures, they have to have mechanisms to avoid having the water in their cells freeze. Well, to do that, we go through two stages or phases. The first phase of hardening, preparing for winter, or acclimation as we call it, is the succession of growth. Obviously, in order for the plant to continue to grow, it has to have water in those cells. They have to be turgid. That's one of the basic requirements for maintaining biological activity. But the first phase is kicked in as the day lengths decrease. Plants aren't stupid. They use day lengths because that's consistent every year. We've had falls where we said, you know what? It's a little warmer than it normally is. And we've had ones where we say it's a little colder than it normally is, or it's colder sooner than it normally is. We've never said, you know what? The days are longer this year than they were last year. That's a schedule. You can look at what the day lengths are going to be 10 years from now and be right on the spot. So as the day lengths decrease, the plants slow that growth process, eventually stop that growth process as their first phase for preparing for winter. We don't need as much water then. We're going to begin drying out. The second phase is initiated by the first hard frost. That's about 28 degrees. 28 degrees is not enough to damage tissue, at least the tissue of stems and twigs and branches. Leaves, of course, it can, but at that point, the leaves have fulfilled their function. And if they've turned brown because of a frost and drop, there's really no loss to the plant. But with that first one, and here's the trick, we need cold nights, warm days. In other words, nights with temperatures below freezing and days with temperatures above freezing. And the reason for that is for plants to prepare for winter. To go into that dormancy requires energy. It does require biological activity, which can only occur at above freezing. But the clue to do that is actually temperatures below freezing. And in fact, you can count the number of freezes and thaws we have in the fall. And that'll be a great predictor of how well the plants can survive winter. If we have a fall where we go very late into the fall, October, and we finally have one freeze and thaw, and then it goes very cold, plants are not prepared for winter enough. If we have one that, let's say early October, we start getting the frost on the pumpkins, those freeze and thaws, and we have days where it gets above freezing and nights where it dips below freezing, that crisp fall air, and that happens repeatedly for the month of October, our plants are very well prepared to go into winter. So two phases. First one's initiated by the decreasing day length. Every tree species has the day length at which tells it to start. And then the number of freeze thaws that really allow them to establish deep cold tolerance. What's kind of interesting here is if you take a look at this chart with 0, this is in Celsius, so freezing temperatures, they really aren't prepared to take very cold temperatures until they really go through that phase 1. Before that, even freezing temperatures can damage plants in midsummer. And then gradually they can adapt to colder and colder temperatures until midwinter. And then we also have endodormancy. These are environmental factors that prevent the resumption of growth in the spring. This is a great picture. I took that in Custer, South Dakota in May 2021. If there's one thing I've learned working out in the Black Hills is you can see snow just about every month of the year. I'm sure folks that are watching this from out there can probably tell me they saw snow in July. I have not yet, but I've seen snow in June. I've seen a little bit of snow, not coming down that much, in August. And I've seen snowstorms in May, and I've seen snowstorms in September. So they have a very long time period of cold temperatures. Now think of that. You're a plant native to that environment. Do you really want to start resuming growth in March, for example? No. And of course, we get those temperature fluctuations out there. They actually did have a warm day recently. Well, it's warm enough that a plant might say, you know what, I better start growing. Nope. they're going to stay dormant for a long time because they know cold weather can occur even in May and frequently does. So what happens is plants have a clock. And when they go dormant, that clock starts ticking. They have to be exposed to a specific number of hours below 45 degrees. Now, it's an accumulation. So you can have several days where you have temperatures in the 30s, several days where you have temperatures in the minus 20, and it doesn't matter. It's just the temperatures are lower than generally 45. And once it has fulfilled that chilling requirement, we call it, it'll break bud if the temperatures are warm enough. This is why we frequently see damage on our exotic plants out in the Black Hills. The reason being is they can certainly get that nice length of warm temperatures in February. Well, some of the plants from other areas have already fulfilled their chilling requirement. Their clock is done ticking. They're ready to break bud. And so when we get a string of warm days, the days are getting longer, they'll break bud prematurely for the Black Hills. It might be correct for where they're native to, the Riviera of France, but not in the Black Hills. And they'll be killed back by that. And we do see that damage, and we see it across the state, of course. But the hills, because of their tremendous temperature fluctuations, we see it more. Where bur oaks in the Black Hills, they've been there a long time. Their clock ticks till May. And at that point, they know, well, okay, if we start getting some warm weather, then we're probably beyond the frost and we can start leafing out. Well, we get that damage almost every year. What you're looking at now is a maple tree. And what happened is that maple had its clock cycle through. It was ready to leaf out. We got a string of warm days. I think it was in March. And that was enough to get it to literally open up its leaves. It was that warm that long. But then the temperatures dropped again into the sub-freezing temperatures, and the entire tree wilted. Now, it was a year where we saw this a lot on maples. I took numerous calls. Gee, my maple tree, it seemed to come out a little early. Yeah, it did. Fulfilled its chilling requirement. We had a string of warm weather. And now it's wilted. Yep, it has. It's going to lose those leaves and produce a second set. Now, we did see dieback that year as well. But again, this just is due to our temperature fluctuations. Well, what really causes this free damage? If you take a look at plant tissue, and cells make up tissue. Cells are the smallest unit of life. And all the tissue in a plant, and the tissue in you're made up of cells, all them, that basic building blocks of life, and they aggregate to form specific functions, and we call that tissue. And you have a lot of tissue, and so do plants. So we have cells, and cells have water. That's a basic ingredient of them. That little water balloon is held together by a membrane, which, unlike a balloon, allows things to enter and exit. That's what they need to do. And that space around them, we call intercellular space, right? They're packed together, but not so tightly that there isn't any distance between them. If those cells freeze, they die. Enough of them die in the tissue dies. Enough of them die in the plant dies. Interesting enough, though, they can have the water freeze in that intercellular space. In other words, in the fall, they're going to have less water in that tissue. But also, if they can move that water out of the cells into the space between the cells, at least a lot of it. If it freezes there, there's less damage. Yes, indeed, you can get it where the frozen water outside the cell ruptures that membrane from the outside rather than the inside. From the inside, it's an absolute. From the outside, it can happen, doesn't happen as often as we might think. So having the water exit the cells, essentially creating yourself into a Pringles potato chip, is a great way to survive our winters. So we have this that, okay, I'm going to freeze around the cells, not in the cells. And that's going to be a strategy for surviving the winters. To do that, with all those cues that fall has come, winter is next, plants react to hormones that tell them, guess what? You need to have water removed from those cells. And so essentially they will begin drying. The cells will actually dehydrate and pull water out. The less water, the better. And the water that's left in that cell, you want as the purest form possible. So you can lower with the temperature at which it actually freezes. In addition, let's put some antifreeze into those cells. Now, not every plant does all these strategies, so there are some exceptions in some ways that combine these different things. But the other thing is sugars and other substances that serve as an antifreeze. So I'm going to remove the water from the cell. What water I have in the cell should be its purest form, or I'm going to pack it filled with antifreeze, right? Substances that will again reduce the freezing point of the water. And what's interesting with these strategies, we have what we call supercooling that allows water to remain in a liquid state below freezing, perhaps as low as -40. -40 is pretty much our threshold for a lot of woody plants. If the air temperature drops below that, -50, a number of our plants, quite a few of our plants are going to be damaged by that. Now, interesting enough, it'll supercool to that, but when it does freeze, it's not going to thaw until it's 32. And you might have seen this. Anyone ever do this? You leave a water bottle in your car overnight and it gets really cold. And, it's purified water you bought somewhere and it's just sitting in the car, and you get in the car in the morning, you go, wait a minute, it's a bottle, and you pick it up and it's still liquid. But the minute you pick it up and you shake it, the ice crystals form and it begins to freeze. And that can also happen. What happened is your water bottle supercooled. The shaking allowed those nucleus to clump, and then the ice crystals began to form. Once the plant reaches the supercooling point, though, all right, its threshold, everything freezes immediately. In other words, once that temperature is reached, whatever it is, a plant can supercool to -32. It can supercool to -60. We do have some. But once that temperature is reached, boom, it freezes and the damage is done. Here's one, because again, we did already get some cold temperatures. This is common smoke bush. Shrub that we like to plant in South Dakota. It does fairly well in South Dakota, but in South Dakota and Minnesota, it is considered a dieback shrub. And the reason it gets that name is quite often the top is tender. Well, this fall, we actually had a nice string of warm weather. Day lengths decreased, but we had warm weather. That second phase didn't really kick in that early this year. And so when we did get freezing temperatures, they had not extracted water out of them yet. In fact, some of them were still growing. It hadn't gotten cold enough. They didn't have a frost yet. And so I'm already seeing a lot of damage like this, where you see these curled over tips on smoke bush that were killed not by our winter temperatures, but they were actually killed back in October. Well, that leads us right into selecting plants. We all decide, well, what are we going to buy because we want to avoid low temperature injuries on our plants? We use the USDA hardiness map. That's kind of our Bible with a small b. That if I'm out going to buy trees or even some perennials, they'll have them listed by the hardiness zone. In other words, the zone number that's as far north as you can grow them. The zones start with 1 way up in Canada and go all the way down to 11 way down in southern Florida and Texas and into Mexico. And we're generally speaking considered to be zone 4. Now, zone maps are relatively recent. They really started in the early 20s, and they were kind of guesstimations. They looked at weather over a time period here, 1895 to 1935, and looked at, well, how cold did it get everywhere? And then kind of guessed what plants could survive it. There wasn't a lot of testing. This was actually done in an office in Boston. So someone in Boston was trying to figure out how plants did here without being here. And there you go. There's our first map. The climatic zones. And you'll notice in South Dakota there, we're crossing 3. They kind of narrowed. And we're in zone, and depending where you were in zone 1, you were in zone 2, or you were in zone 3 in our state. Rather broadly, they didn't have a lot of good weather data at that time. But the idea caught on that maybe if we look at temperature, we could decide what plants could grow. And from that, they came up with better maps. You can take a look at this one out from the 30s. And they looked at, okay, here's the temperature ranges. And you notice we had several that crossed South Dakota. And then eventually it became the Wyman's map. And we became zone 3. And if you look in this map, zone 3, that was -35 to -20. Now, we've gotten rid of the Wyman's map and gone to the USDA. They took this over, I think, in about the early 70s or so. But nevertheless, this concept of dividing our country into zones to determine how plants would perform regards to winter caught on, and that's what we use. And it's very common. And that led us to our most recent map, which again, we're zone 4. But here's the problem with zone maps, particularly when we get out into the center of the country like we have. It's based upon one factor: the minimum temperature of the coldest month, which they take as January. Now, I know we've had years where February was actually our coldest month. Maybe January wasn't that bad. We've seen those. And then suddenly the temperature just drops. But generally speaking, January, towards the end of January, are going to be our coldest temperature. So everything's based upon that one factor. How cold does it get? And based on that, we're zone 4. That we have a little bit of zone 5 for you folks that are watching down in Clay, Yankton, Gregory County. You're actually zone 5. It doesn't get quite as cold there. And by the way, this also applies to Pierre, and it applies to kind of the crescent from Rapid City all the way up to Spearfish, and then down to Custer and even into Hot Springs. You have slightly warmer weather, winter weather. And so you're considered zone 5, a minimum temperature of between -10 and -20 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, we are getting slightly milder winters. We're seeing that. And I've looked at, this is Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and this is looking at it from 1971 all the way up to the current. And that broad band there is the minimum temperature -20 to -30 for zone 4. And I've got for the points there, the minimum temperature for each winter. So we had winters where the temperatures were, our minimum temperature was actually like -5. That's how cold it got. Or -10 or -11. We do get a lot of those, and we're seeing more of those recently. But we're still seeing the temperatures down to the -30s and the -20s. And so despite this fact that we're getting slightly warmer winters, the temperature fluctuations are such, the year-to-year variation is such, you still have to count on cold winters, -20 to -30. Don't assume that, okay, we can bump everything up a zone, as people frequently hope they can. So getting slightly warmer, but here's our other problem. With that, we're getting greater seasonal fluctuations, and that's our problem. So South Dakota in the year 2100, you know what? We're going to be a palm paradise. I mean, no, we got two terms to discuss: variability and change. Climate change is that long-term change. Okay, yes, it's going to gradually get warmer or gradually get colder. And well, I'll let the climatologist deal with that. What I'm looking at is climate variability, that temperature fluctuation from year to year. And we're seeing more spring frosts, such as this one in May, that the amber maples had already leafed out and were killed. And we see them in the fall as well, where it stays nice and warm and the temperature drops very quickly. And that's important. Red Osier dogwood. Look what it can tolerate in the middle of winter. -20. It can only tolerate 15 in late April. So when do we get winter kill with the air quotes on dogwoods? We get it in the fall and the spring. You do not live anywhere in South Dakota where it hits -20. We don't count air temperature. All right. So you're pretty safe. So when we look at plant materials, it's the fluctuations we have to be concerned about. That's generally where our winter injury occurs. And I'll use Norway maple as an example. Norway maple, crimson king, the purple leaf maples are ones people really like. They're considered hardy to zone 4 to 7. Well, we're in zone 4, so we should be good to go on this. Zone 7 is much further south. But I want you to look at this chart. On the left is the minimum temperature it can survive. Okay, the coldest it can get to before it freezes. The middle is our average low temperature, and at the right is our record low temperature. And notice that if we look at the averages, okay, our general winter temperatures, that Crimson King can actually tolerate our cold winters. What it can't tolerate is our March. Okay, and of course, in our record lows, you'll flat out kill it, even fall or spring, or even midwinter. But again, the point is a lot of our winter injury occurs in the spring and the fall as plants are preparing for winter or coming out of dormancy. Emerald Queen Norway maple, another nice tree. And if we look at that, same hardiness zone, slightly different, but that same pattern. And I see this frequently on our maples. A lot of our, quote, winter injury on maples occurs in the spring. They're not quite ready, okay? They have already deacclimated, all right, starting to prepare, and they can't tolerate temperatures even below freezing, below 0. Legacy sugar maple, this also occurs with those in some cases. Notice again, and I want you to look at October. They really need warm temperatures then. And once again, most of our damage actually occurs in the spring because the temperatures, they can't take that low. They can't take that below 0 temperatures anymore. Otherwise, a wonderful tree, but here's an unusual one, box elder. You might say box elder in winter, it'll survive anything. No. Sensation box elder, one of my favorite trees, by the way, has a brilliant red fall color. It's a shame we can't grow it in much of the state. You go, what? Box elder? No, it winter kills. You think box elder, it's a zone 3A tree. Should survive anywhere here, not this cultivar. And the species can, but this particular cultivar was found in an abandoned farmstead over in western Idaho. And it was actually found in more of a zone 5/6 location. So that particular cultivar, the genetics of that cultivar are not used to our winters this cold. And it's not used to quite our same fall spring fluctuations. And boy, did we see that this year. Okay. It really ought to be sold as a 5/6 plant rather than a 2. You see this 4B plant. No, not quite. Again, a wonderful tree, but you've got to be so cautious with it. And here's what happened. If we take a look at it, it can, from its native range, it can take 25 degrees Fahrenheit in October. And we got down to 16 in the Sioux Falls, Brookings area. Okay. So in other words, we got too cold in October. Now, in November, it can take -1, and we didn't get that cold. And in December, it can take -16, and we got close to it, but not there. So when did we already start seeing the damage on this plant? When did I start getting the calls? In October. Because in October, we were getting temperatures far below what it could tolerate. There's still too much water in the cells. The plant had not acclimated enough for the winter time, and we ended up with all this dieback to this. Oops, there we go. And by the way, Just as a note, that also applies to other box elders. I'll give you a rule of thumb. The nicer the box elder cultivar, the less likely it is to grow in South Dakota. The one that grows in every ditch, yep, it's ours. But the real nice cultivars like Kelly's Gold, which is really pretty, not a chance. They grow those in Washington, D.C. What about red maples, the true red maples? We have some that have adapted here, but once again, there's quite a variation within the species. There's red maple growing in Delane, Florida. It's native there. It's also native in northern Minnesota. If you take one of these from Florida and move it up, can't take our winters. Our winters are too cold. They've adapted to an entirely different temperature and day length. If you're planting Northwood red maple, which is actually a tree up by Floodwood, Minnesota, pretty good chance of surviving our winters. Does fairly well here. Again, not always our soils though, but that's a whole different discussion. But if you're trying to grow red sunset, which is actually from a seed source over in Ohio, no, does not take our winters at all. And you can see that by this chart. It's our real cold record winters is what kills it, but it's also, once again, our March. In March, it's already ready to grow. And unfortunately, our temperatures are too cold. So it's our springs and fall with that tremendous variation that really causes the problems. And we get pictures like this. I took this one in Rapid City a couple of years ago. Here it is, choke cherries, snow hanging from them. Anyone out there says, yep, see that all the time. And eastern of the state, we get the same problem with magnolias. They leaf out too early. And here's frost injury on May 10th. Or this one, down in Hutchinson, had broken bud, and now we've got damage on it. And by the way, there is a difference in plant parts, how hardy they become. So our winter injury can be different depending on the plant part. For example, viburnums, the twigs can tolerate minus 22 for this particular cultivar. That's fairly cold. The woody roots, 15 degrees. The non-woody roots, 19 degrees. Where do we see root problems? Well, here's one I got to look at last year. We had a fairly open winter. Last winter, I never even pulled our snowblower out. This winter, I've used it multiple times. So we had a lot of areas without a lot of snow on the ground. And it did get cold, not extremely cold, but it did get cold. And I was called out to look at an apple orchard. And when I went out to the apple orchard, all their Honeycrisp were dying. They had leafed out and were wilting. Some of them only partially leafed out and wilted. Some got that far and wilted. And then there were other Honeycrisp that were doing just fine. What was the problem? These rows were growing on a dwarfing rootstock. Okay, not a standard rootstock, which is usually a Dougall crabapple, very hardy. The rootstock here was not hardy. It was an M7 rootstock, and 12 degrees is lethal to them. And so when you're using the dwarfing rootstocks, you're hoping for snow, which will help insulate that base, or you've got a lot of mulch around the plants. Usually we have adequate snow and rootstocks do just fine. But with open winters, we do see it where the top dies, or excuse me, the top dies. Why? Because the roots are already dead, or enough of the roots have died that they're not able to take up water. So we have to be also conscious of, for example, fruit trees. What rootstock did we put it on? Is the rootstock hardy? Can it tolerate our cold temperatures? And we're always surprised, or most people are surprised, by how different the roots are from the top of the tree, because we graft all these together as ornamental trees and as fruit trees. If you're buying trees for your conservation district, most of those seedling trees, those are growing on their own roots. We don't have to worry about the roots. They're as hardy as the top. But when you're buying ornamental trees, named cultivars, the roots are going to be different. And here, Triumph Elm, beautiful tree, by the way, one of my favorites, but they graft them on Siberian elm rootstock. So when they start to sucker at the base, you're actually getting a Siberian elm. But here's the problem that we do see with winter hardiness in our state. This is State Street maple, a maple I do like. And again, I have a concern about overplanting maples just because of their popularity and the fact that if something comes into the state and attacks maples, we're going to lose another big chunk of our tree cover. But it's a nice tree, no question. Good growing, tolerates poor soils, doesn't require a lot of pruning, nice fall color. I like the fall color to it. But here's the problem. That's the way the leaves look like. But they graft these on hedge maple, entirely different tree. You say, I've never heard of hedge maple. There's a reason for that. It's not hardy for South Dakota. They grow about as far north as Norfolk, Nebraska. And there they get about as big as this picture you see. So they're a definite zone 5, actually a 5B tree. Again, we get a few now and then down in Yankton, but even those tend to fade out. That's what their leaves look like. And you can go out and see State Street maples that at the base of the tree where the suckers are, the leaves look like this. And here's the problem. We get a cold, open winter, we had State Street maples die. The top is perfectly hardy for South Dakota. It'll tolerate anywhere in the state as far as our minimum winter temperatures. And it seems to do well with our temperature fluctuations. Trouble is, it's on the wrong rootstock. And if we get an open winter, that rootstock will die because it cannot tolerate temperatures as low as we get in the area. So we're really depending on snow being a good enough insulator. This year, not an issue. We've had plenty. Well, what about pests? That's the other part of the equation. You know, that we do see winter injury on our trees. Most of it's spring injury. Remember, they're starting to come out of dormancy too soon. But we also have problems with wrong rootstocks. And we have some that just cannot tolerate our winter. They cannot tolerate that much cold. But let's look at pests, and it's worthy to mention a minute on EAB, of course. Emerald ash borer is a concern across the state. At this point in time, it's only been confirmed in Lincoln and Minnehaha County. Doesn't mean it may not be elsewhere, but we have not confirmed it yet. But perhaps it is only in those 2 counties at this point in time. Nevertheless, we're all going to be out there looking for it, and we'll be chatting about it on a spring episode of this. But we have a lot of ash in the state, almost anywhere you go. Here's Watertown. Now, those are not infested trees, but it's a whole street of ash. On the other hand, we do get streets like this in the state. And all those trees that are dying, that is emerald ash borer. And that's after the trees have been infested for 2 years. So in some communities, it is going through the community very, very quickly. Well, what applies to plants applies to animals. In fact, applies to us with frostbite. But once again, we don't want those cells filled with water. Now, for us, we don't withdraw water. Okay, we go in the house. But insects can do the same thing that plants can do. They can survive in a partially dehydrated state. They can also put in antifreeze into those cells so they can take cold temperatures, and they also undergo in supercooling. In other words, they can tolerate a cold temperature to a point, then freeze. So what happens with emerald ash borer then? How cold can it take? We got lucky. The emerald ash borer that was introduced is actually from that darkened area of China. And that star is kind of climatically where we are in China, if we were. In other words, the emerald ash borers that arrived in this country are not as cold hardy as the emerald ash borers found farther north. In fact, when emerald ash borer first arrived in this country, the Chinese researchers said, well, these can only take temperatures down to about -10 degrees. And automatically, well, hey, we're lucky. Well, no, not quite. And I'm going to show you the problem. In studies that have been done, and the first one was done in 2010 out of Minnesota, and it was a fascinating study. But they looked at cutting logs and seeing how low a temperatures the larvae could survive, because the worm stage is the overwintering stage with emerald ash borer. And they found about 5% of the larvae died at 0 degrees. 34 at -10, 80% at -20, and 99% at -30. Now, by the way, that's under bark temperatures. That is the actual temperature of that insect. In other words, when it hit -30, they supercooled. They froze, and they cannot thaw out from that. They're going to die. It ruptures the cells, and they're dead. How that insect survives the winter depends on what stage it's in. Where they should be is in their overwintering cell to the left of the circle here. That's what we call the J-shaped fourth instar larvae. Okay, they actually burrow deeper into the sapwood of the tree, form this overwintering chamber, dehydrate, pump themselves full of antifreeze. Think of it as eggnog for the winter. All right, and they're fine. They'll survive our winter. Some, though, are a little late, procrastinating emerald ash borers, and they're still just beneath the bark. In, for example, the third instar, they cannot survive as cold at temperatures. And so what we see in South Dakota is if you don't enter that J-shaped, you probably die. Now, remember, there's about a 5-degree difference here. -20 is what the air temperature might be, but only -15 in the chamber. So you always have to kind of take that deduction. But we're still sampling throughout the winter. There's our samples that we go. We cut the branches, and then we peel them. We have to peel them fairly deep in order to find those overwintering chambers. And we're looking at what they look like, and they're kind of like bananas in a sense. You know, all of you that put a banana in their freezer and pulled it out and it turns black, that's what emerald ash borers do. There's an overwintering chamber, and you can see there we pulled out the J-shaped larvae, and it's as happy as a larvae could be, curled up like a cat for a long winter's nap, and quite surprised that we broke into its house. But it was doing okay in our winter so far. But look at that one. It had tried to survive just beneath the bark, where it's going to be exposed to those colder temperatures much quicker, and it doesn't produce as much antifreeze. It's not prepared for as cold temperatures. And so we kill these, and we kill them quite easily. Killed quite a few so far this winter. And let's look back. The winter of 2017, that January, we actually got as low as -6. We probably killed about 10% or so of the larvae that were present in the state at that time, Sioux Falls area. 2018, when we first confirmed it, we got down to -23. That killed a bunch. I remember starting to peel logs that spring and finding dead larvae from that winter. 2019 was great. First year we confirmed it, we hit temperatures down to -20. We killed 90% of them. Well, that sounds good, but I'm going to bend that back just a bit, because at -25 we experienced on January 29th, and the nights surrounding it were equally cold. We had only a few die in the trunk. Why? The trunk's bigger, bark is thicker. You might even have snow up against it. Even though at -25, it didn't get -25 down in that cell. But any that were up in the thinner bark and the branches, more exposed to the cold, we killed lots of those. Overall, we figured we killed about 30% from that cold snap. Now, again, chart would say 90% of them die. Yes, but that would be 90% in the top of the tree, not 90% at the bottom where they're much better insulated. So an extremely cold winter, we can lose a third. Now, again, if we just look at air temperature, 2020, maybe -30 would be killed by that temperature. And remember, since we're looking at bigger trees, we probably lost only 5%. One of the interesting things is the spring of 2019, population did not expand that much. Why? We killed a lot of them because of that cold snap. Population in the spring of 2020 went crazy. Why? We had almost no overwintering mortality. And the following year, 2021, probably none almost. Even just the temperature alone would only kill 10% of them. And remember, with that 5-degree bark difference and thicker trees, no, I'd go through sample after sample after sample and not find any killed. And then 2022, Well, we got down to about -10 again, so we lost some, and we'll see how this winter goes. We're not at the end of January yet. We did have that cold snap in December, and yes, that's been responsible for killing a significant number so far. But it'd be nice to have another cold snap, and I'd love to see -35 for 2 days. That would help us out a lot. But here's the other bad news. If you survive the winter, your genes are going to go in the next population. So winter after winter after winter, what are we going to end up with? Emerald ash borers that can tolerate colder and colder temperatures. So do not rely on winter to really reduce our problem long term. Same thing applied to mountain pine beetle, just to give you another example, that this insect that also goes through the larval stage during the winter, it can super cool, survive temperatures down to a certain temperature. It's usually down in that -30 range and that they can take. But if we get extremely cold weather, and we have had that in the past, here you're looking at the beginning of our epidemic in 97, we had a real cold snap. And then after that, it got warm. That may have contributed to the outbreak, that we had a long period there without cold winter temperatures. And some other areas, they found that one of the factors in a mountain pine beetle outbreak was warmer winters, so we didn't get the overwinter mortality. And I might mention, when it ended, we started getting colder winters again. Now, that's only one factor that caused the epidemic to end, but nevertheless, it is a factor. We do have other insects, the mourning cloak butterfly, where the butterfly survives the winter. Isn't that interesting? Not a worm beneath the bark, not a larvae, but actually the adult. Now, the adult will hide in crevices and such, just buried in the duff layer, pile stuff, so to speak. But it can super cool to -30. -30. So the adult is able to do that. And we have others. We have the European elm flea weevil, where the adult overwinters. And it can super cool to some fairly low temperatures, but quite honestly, we do kill a lot of them during our winter. We've probably lost a lot so already in December, where it got extremely cold. But eggs. Now, there are exceptions, there always are, but most of the insects that are native here or well established here, they'll take their egg stage, will take our cold temperatures. Look at this, aphid eggs, -40. We don't have much of a chance of a cold winter taking rid of our aphids out there, or frankly, any of our other insects that spend the winter in the egg stage. The ones that are most vulnerable are those that survive the winter as adults or larvae. And while, as I pointed out, many can super cool to a certain temperature, they also depend to survive our winters on covering themselves up enough, either deep inside the tree or buried in litter, to provide that little extra protection to keep them from dropping to temperatures of less than -30. What about pathogens, though? No luck there. When we take a look at our disease pathogens that are common on woody plants in our state, -40 is fine. So you'll never have me, or perhaps very rarely, there's always exceptions, ever say, well, you know what, that real cold winter really knocked back X disease. Reason being is that disease can probably survive as cold of temperatures as we're going to get. So we're not going to see any disease reductions because of cold weather. In fact, we'll see an increase in diseases in cold weather. And the reason for that is many of our diseases are weak pathogens. They're opportunistic. They actually do best when we have stressed plants. And here's a good example. This is one of my favorite trees. I have a lot, it's kind of like pick your kids. Northern acclaim honey locust. It's a North Dakota State University introduction. They did a fine job of introducing this plant. It's one of the better honey locusts I've seen. It is hardy to zone 3, which makes sense. It was developed and selected in North Dakota. But we also have a lot of honey locusts, such as the Imperial, Skyline, and such, that actually were selected from areas further south. They may be zone 4 or 5 plants. Now, this year we did see some winter kill on honey locusts, except for the northern acclaim. But many winters, we really don't see winter damage, but it happens. In fact, we get nectaria canker. And what happens is that canker develops right around the branch union where it's attached. That tissue is a little bit more sensitive to cold. And what happens is the cold winter, again, a combination of fall and spring, so it's a winter period, causes some of the cells to die there, leaving wounds. And those wounds provide an opening for this fungus disease. And since the tissue is wounded and the fungus is opportunistic, it can spread rather quickly. So with cold winters, cold weather, we frequently see more fungal problems. The reason being, first of all, the fungus itself can survive our cold weather, so it's not really affected by our cold. But we've stressed the plants, and the stressed plants are more susceptible to it. And this is a good example. I see nectaria canker quite a bit, particularly after some streak of some real cold winters or cold springs and falls on a number of our honey locust cultivar, but I have not seen it, to date at least, on the northern acclaim honey locust. Well, that's it for today. As I said, this would run a little shorter, not a lot, of course. We're kind of coming up to the hour here. So I appreciate everybody logging in today. I see we had a lot of people. I always appreciate the attendance. If you're an ISA member, the CEU code is DS23008. Now, again, that's only for watching this live presentation. So you need to submit it fairly soon. If it's from the recorded, you really can't. The other thing I'm going to mention, and I'm going to turn it over to Tony for any finishing remarks, is that our next show, which will be in March, we do every other month during the winter, will be on something we're all going to be thinking about by March. And that is, what trees and shrubs should we be planting? So I look forward to that one. But for right now, I'll turn it back to Tony, who's been our host. So Tony, it's back to you.
Thanks, Dr. Ball, and thanks to all our participants. We had over 60 people attending our live presentation today, so that's a great turnout for our first Forest Health Workshop of the year. I have added a link in the chat to our YouTube playlist that has all 8 of our previous workshops listed on one convenient playlist for you to go back and look at your leisure. We're working on getting that link also posted to the Forest Health website page as well. So thanks again, everybody. I do have one question in the chat box right now. While I'm looking for more questions, if you have not yet, please make sure to include your Society of American Foresters credential or SAF number to receive the half CEU that's available for this workshop. And as Dr. Ball mentioned, for any certified arborists, the ISA CEU code is there on the screen right now. That'll be on you, the certified arborist, to report that for the available credit. I do have one question here for you, Dr. Ball. Deanna asks if the box elders grown at Big Sioux Nursery are okay for shelter belts.
Yes, and by okay, survive our winters. The Big Sioux Nursery, which does provide a lot of our material for windbreaks, I wish everybody knew what care they use for selecting seed sources. They make a special point that the materials that are collected for them to grow as material going out in windbreaks is well adapted to our climate. So if you're buying box elders from them, and I think it's an underutilized tree, period, and you're planting that, I have no concerns about our winters. They're they're well adapted to it, as well as their other trees. They do a very good job of making sure that the seeds they collect are from trees that are adapted to South Dakota.
Great. And how about watering, John? Can you water too late in the fall? Is late watering harmful to trees?
That's an excellent question. And when I went to college, back when we actually had stone tablets, we were told withhold watering in the fall because you want those plants to dry out, not realizing that a plant has to be healthy in order to do this. So watering in the fall is actually a good practice. It's never good to overwater, but the idea with holding water intentionally to have them dehydrate is not a good idea. So you want to maintain your watering regimen into the fall, probably less with cooler temperatures, but don't have any fear that by doing that, you're going to somehow reduce its hardiness, with this one exception. If the plant is not adapted here, a good example, I plant a sensation box elder in Brookings, which people have done, and we have a long mild fall, and I keep that thing watered, it'll actually grow very late into the fall and we'll get some damage. So occasionally that can happen, but withholding water doesn't help it. So maintain your water regime in the fall. It's actually beneficial to the plant to improve, generally, to improve its hardiness.
Great. I have another question here from Charles. You spoke about absolute minimum temperatures, but not necessarily the duration of the cold. So could you touch on that? You know, can an apple tree survive longer for longer periods in less cold temperatures, or how does that work?
You know, that's a great question. And remember, the supercooling means when it hits that temperature, it freezes. So that's why we have it as a temperature. But he's right that how long does it take for that tissue to get that cold? In other words, for that cold to permeate the bark of the plant. And that can take a day or so. So generally speaking, if we get a overnight where for a brief period it hit -20, that doesn't mean we're going to see all that damage, except on the twigs. That's why you get this little twig dieback. The trunk might survive because it's going to take a long time for that cold to get in. So that would be where the time would be important. That the temperature itself, if it's exposed to that temperature, it freezes it, super cools. But how long does it take for that temperature to permeate the bark and get to the particular tissue? So there's the question.
How about rootstock identification? How do you know what rootstock is grafted to your tree when purchasing?
Well, that's a problem. If you're doing fruit trees, that's easy. Every fruit tree you buy, it will have a named rootstock. And in my book, Trees of the Northern Plains, I specify what rootstocks are adapted to the different temperatures in our state. And you'll find those guides up everywhere. If it's an ornamental tree, that's much tougher. Nobody really keeps track of it. And that's a real problem. And it often switches from year to year. So unfortunately, when you're looking at ornamental trees, I wish the industry would actually be watching this closely. They don't yet. But for fruit trees, yes, we do know minimum winter temperatures for all the rootstocks. And depending on where you are in the state, you're going to select different rootstocks for your fruit trees based upon what your minimum winter temperatures are.
I have another question here from Jim. This is in regard to pruning, specifically cedars and pines. Would it be advisable to leave 2 to 3 inches of a stub from the main trunk on those branches?
For pines, no. You want to prune them properly, which means at the collar, right at the trunk, not flush with the trunk, and do that. But, you know, you bring up an interesting point there, and that is on marginally hardy plants such as burning bush, euonymus, you don't want to prune those in the fall. And the reason being is pruning can, as trees are going dormant or shrubs are going dormant, kind of activate their growth a little bit more. And I've seen people winter kill burning bush by heavily pruning them in the fall. So I would say try not to heavily prune in the fall, any tree or shrub that's marginally hardy, but any pruning that you do at any time, prune to the collar.
Perfect. Kathy has a question. Does a fall application of muriate of potash help shrub stems harden off to help with cold temperatures?
No, it does not. And thank you for that question. That's commonly mentioned as a hardening product. In other words, we do that, improves winter hardiness, but not to any significant degree, not for our woody plants. Good question.
Wonderful. Well, I don't see any more questions at this time. One final call for any SAF credit or excuse me, SAF numbers, certified forester numbers. And if there's any other questions, feel free to add them in the box or reach out to us via email. We look forward to seeing everybody in March and look for that flyer soon.
All right. Enjoy your winter. Thanks for the questions. Goodbye.